Police laugh at elderly man's complaints, then they find his medals at home. The sun had just begun to set on the sleepy town of Millbrook, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks and faded storefronts. As the last remnants of daylight clung to the horizon, an elderly man named Arthur slowly made his way down Main Street, his weathered cane tapping a steady rhythm against the concrete. His destination, the local police station, a squat brick building that stood as a sentinel at the corner of Elm and Oak. Arthur's journey was not an easy one. Each step sent a jolt of pain through his arthritic knees, a constant reminder of the toll that time had taken on his once strong body. But the physical discomfort paled in comparison to the anxiety that gnawed at his insides. For weeks now, he had been the target of relentless harassment from a group of local teenagers, and tonight, he was determined to seek help. As he pushed open the heavy glass door of the police station, Arthur took a deep breath, steeling himself for the conversation ahead. The interior was bathed in harsh fluorescent light, a stark contrast to the warm glow of twilight outside. The air smelled of stale coffee and bureaucracy, a scent that brought back memories of his own time in uniform, decades ago. At the front desk sat Officer Mitchell, a young man barely out of the academy. His crisp blue uniform and neatly trimmed hair spoke of ambition and a desire to climb the ranks. As Arthur approached, Mitchell's eyes flickered up briefly before returning to the stack of paperwork before him. "Can I help you?" Mitchell asked, his tone more perfunctory than welcoming. Arthur cleared his throat, his voice wavering slightly as he began to speak. "Yes, officer. I'm here to report a problem. You see, there's a group of teenagers who've been causing trouble around my house. They've been vandalizing my property, throwing rocks at my windows, and..." Before Arthur could finish, Mitchell held up a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Let me guess, old-timer. Kids making noise, maybe knocking over a trash can or two?" The dismissive tone in Mitchell's voice was unmistakable, and Arthur felt a surge of frustration. He tried again, his words coming out more forcefully this time. "No, it's more than that. They've been defacing my fence with graffiti, trespassing on my property at night. I'm worried it's going to escalate." Mitchell leaned back in his chair, exchanging a knowing glance with Officer Davis, who had wandered over from the water cooler. Davis, a stocky man with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow, smirked as he chimed in. "Sounds like typical teenage shenanigans to me. Why don't you try talking to their parents?" Arthur's shoulders slumped as he realized his concerns were falling on deaf ears. He had hoped for understanding, for assistance, but instead found himself confronted with indifference and thinly veiled amusement. The officers before him saw not a man in distress, but a caricature. The grumpy old neighbor, shaking his fist at the sky and complaining about kids these days. "I've tried talking to the parents," Arthur explained, his voice tinged with desperation. "They don't take it seriously. They think their kids are just having harmless fun." Mitchell sighed, clearly growing impatient. "Look, Mr. Graham, Arthur Graham. Mr. Graham, I'm sure it seems like a big deal to you, but we've got real crimes to deal with. Burglaries, assaults, that sort of thing. We can't go chasing after every kid who decides to play ding-dong ditch." Arthur felt a lump forming in his throat. He had faced down enemy fire, navigated treacherous terrain, and led men through the chaos of war. Yet here he stood, powerless in the face of bureaucratic apathy. The irony was not lost on him. "I understand you have more pressing matters," Arthur said, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. "But this is more than just a prank. I don't feel safe in my own home anymore. Surely that counts for something." Davis let out a chuckle, shaking his head. "Come on, old-timer. You've probably seen worse in your day. These are just kids blowing off steam. They'll get bored eventually and move on to something else." The casual dismissal of his fears felt like a physical blow. Arthur's grip tightened on his cane, knuckles turning white with the effort of maintaining his composure. He had come here seeking protection, seeking justice, but found only mockery and indifference. "I see," Arthur said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for your time, officers." As he turned to leave, Arthur could hear Mitchell and Davis exchanging hushed comments, punctuated by poorly suppressed laughter. The sound followed him out into the night, a bitter reminder of his powerlessness. The walk home seemed longer than before, each step heavier than the last. As Arthur approached his modest house, he could see the fresh graffiti on his fence, stark and angry against the peeling white paint. Rocks littered his once pristine lawn, silent testaments to the harassment he had endured. Arthur paused at his front gate, looking back towards the town center. The police station lights glowed in the distance, a beacon of safety and justice for some, but not for him. Not tonight. With a heavy sigh, he pushed open the gate and made his way up the cracked pathway to his front door. As he fumbled with his keys, Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that he had been abandoned by the very system he had once sworn to protect and serve. Little did he know, this night marked only the beginning of a journey that would challenge not only his faith in justice, but also the town's understanding of heroism and respect. The old grandfather clock in Arthur's living room chimed 11 as he shuffled through the front door, its familiar tone a stark contrast to the tumultuous emotions churning within him. The house, a modest two-bedroom bungalow on the outskirts of Millbrook, had been his sanctuary for over 4 decades. Now, as he stood in the dimly lit entryway, it felt more like a prison than a home. Arthur's trembling fingers fumbled with the light switch, flooding the room with a warm, yellow glow. The sudden brightness revealed a space frozen in time, faded floral wallpaper, well-worn furniture, and shelves lined with mementos from a life richly lived. Each object told a story, from the chipped mug he'd brought back from his tour of duty to the hand-knitted Afghan draped over his favorite armchair, a last gift from his late wife, Margaret. With a heavy sigh, Arthur lowered himself into the armchair, wincing as his joints protested the movement. The events at the police station played on repeat in his mind, each recollection bringing a fresh wave of humiliation and frustration. He had faced enemy fire, led men through treacherous terrain, and made decisions that meant the difference between life and death. Yet here he was, in his twilight years, powerless against a group of unruly teenagers and dismissed by the very institution he had once proudly served. His gaze wandered to the mantelpiece, where a collection of framed photographs stood like silent sentinels. There was Margaret on their wedding day, her smile as radiant as the summer sun. Next to it, a group shot of his old unit, young men with serious faces and eyes that had seen too much. And there, tucked slightly behind the others, a yellowed newspaper clipping with the headline, "Local Hero Receives Bronze Star." The face in the photograph was barely recognizable as his own, younger, stronger, with a determined set to his jaw and a fire in his eyes that time had long since extinguished. Arthur's fingers absently traced the outline of the wooden box sitting on the side table next to him. It was a simple thing, unassuming in its appearance, but it held his most prized possessions. With reverence, he lifted the lid, revealing a collection of medals nestled in velvet. The bronze star gleamed dully in the lamplight, its weight a testament to the sacrifices he had made. Beside it lay the Purple Heart, a reminder of the physical and emotional scars he carried. As he cradled the medals in his weathered hands, Arthur's mind drifted back to that fateful day in the scorching desert. The air had been thick with dust and the acrid smell of gunpowder. His unit had been pinned down, taking heavy fire from an unseen enemy. In that moment of chaos and fear, Arthur had found a wellspring of courage he didn't know he possessed. He had rallied his men, devised a daring flanking maneuver, and led the charge that ultimately saved dozens of lives. The memory was so vivid, so real, that for a moment, Arthur could almost feel the weight of his rifle in his hands, hear the shouts of his comrades, and taste the metallic tang of adrenaline on his tongue. But as quickly as it came, the moment passed, leaving him once again an old man alone in a quiet house, holding the symbols of a valor that seemed to have no place in this modern world. A sudden noise from outside jolted Arthur from his reverie. His heart raced as he hobbled to the window, peering out into the darkness. Was it the teenagers again, coming to torment him further? But the street was empty, save for a stray cat darting across the road. Arthur's shoulders sagged with relief, even as he berated himself for his paranoia. He made his way to the kitchen, his movements slow and deliberate. The linoleum floor was cold beneath his feet as he filled the kettle for a cup of tea, a nightly ritual that had brought him comfort for years. As the water boiled, Arthur leaned against the counter, his eyes drawn to the calendar hanging on the wall. Red circles marked the dates of his grandchildren's visits, bright spots of joy in the monotony of his days. But those circles were few and far between, a painful reminder of how isolated he had become. The whistle of the kettle pierced the silence, and Arthur went through the motions of preparing his tea. The familiar routine brought a small measure of calm to his troubled mind. As he waited for the tea to steep, he found himself wondering what Margaret would say if she could see him now. She had always been his rock, his voice of reason. In the years since her passing, he had tried to channel her strength, her unwavering optimism in the face of adversity. "What would you do, Maggie?" he whispered to the empty kitchen, his voice barely audible over the ticking of the clock. As if in answer, his eyes fell on the phone hanging on the wall. For a moment, he considered calling his daughter, Sarah. She lived a few towns over with her husband and kids, always urging Arthur to move closer. But the thought of burdening her with his problems, of admitting that he couldn't handle things on his own, was too much to bear. He was supposed to be the strong one, the protector. How could he tell her that he felt helpless in his own home? Cup in hand, Arthur made his way back to the living room. He paused by the window, looking out at the quiet street. The fresh graffiti on his fence stood out starkly in the moonlight, a jarring reminder of the troubles that awaited him in the morning. He thought about the teenagers responsible for the vandalism, wondering what drove them to such acts of disrespect and cruelty. In his day, there had been a sense of community, of looking out for one's neighbors. When had that changed? As he settled back into his armchair, Arthur's gaze fell on an old photo album peeking out from the bookshelf. On an impulse, he reached for it, carefully turning the brittle pages. Each photograph was a window into the past. Arthur in his uniform, standing tall and proud, Margaret and him at community picnics, surrounded by smiling neighbors, their children growing up on these very streets. One particular photo caught his eye, a much younger Arthur, still in uniform, kneeling beside a group of children. He remembered that day clearly. It was just after he'd returned from his tour of duty, and he'd been invited to speak at the local school. The children had been in awe of his medals, peppering him with questions about bravery and heroism. Arthur traced the faces in the photograph with a trembling finger. Those children would be grown now, possibly with children of their own. Did any of them remember that day? Did they still hold on to the values of respect and civic duty he had tried to instill? As the night wore on, Arthur found himself lost in memories, both bitter and sweet. The tea grew cold in his cup, forgotten as he turned page after page of the album. Each photograph was a testament to a life lived with purpose, to sacrifices made and honors earned. Yet here he sat, feeling more alone and vulnerable than he ever had on the battlefield. The first light of dawn was beginning to creep through the curtains when Arthur finally closed the album. His joints were stiff from sitting so long, and his eyes burned with fatigue. But as he slowly made his way to his bedroom, there was a new resolve forming in the depths of his weary heart. He may have been dismissed by the police, may feel powerless against the harassment he faced, but Arthur Graham was not a man to give up easily. He had faced worse odds before and come out on top. Somehow, some way, he would find a solution to this problem. He owed it to himself, to Margaret's memory, and to the man he had once been, the hero whose face smiled back at him from those yellowed photographs. As he lay in bed, waiting for sleep to claim him, Arthur made a silent promise to himself. He would not let this defeat him. He would find a way to reclaim his peace, his dignity, and perhaps in doing so, remind Millbrook of the values it seemed to have forgotten. With that thought, he drifted off into an uneasy slumber, unaware that the coming days would test his resolve in ways he could never have imagined. The days that followed Arthur's visit to the police station seemed to blur together in a haze of anxiety and sleepless nights. Each sunset brought with it a renewed sense of dread, as Arthur found himself constantly on edge, waiting for the next act of vandalism or harassment. The teenagers, emboldened by their apparent immunity, seemed to take a perverse pleasure in tormenting the old man who lived alone at the end of Maple Street. It began with small acts of mischief, a mailbox knocked over here, a potted plant upended there. But as the days wore on, the incidents grew more frequent and more brazen. Arthur would wake to find his carefully tended rose bushes trampled, empty beer cans strewn across his lawn like a mocking tribute to his impotence in the face of their cruelty. One particularly humid evening, as Arthur sat on his porch trying to catch a breeze, he heard the telltale sound of snickering from the shadows beyond his property line. His heart rate quickened, palms growing sweaty as he gripped the arms of his rocking chair. He knew what was coming, but the anticipation did nothing to dull the shock when the first egg splattered against the side of his house, its yolk running down the faded siding like tears. "Hey, old man!" a voice called out from the darkness. "Why don't you go back inside where you belong?" Another egg flew, this one narrowly missing Arthur's head as he struggled to his feet. The laughter that followed was cruel, devoid of any trace of youthful mischief. This was something darker, a targeted campaign meant to drive him from his home, to break his spirit. "Please," Arthur called out, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and anger. "Why are you doing this? I've never done anything to harm you." His pleas were met with more laughter and a barrage of eggs. As Arthur retreated inside, he could hear the sounds of spray paint cans being shaken, the hiss of aerosol punctuating the night air. He knew that come morning, he would find new, crude messages scrawled across his fence and walkway. As he locked the door behind him, hands trembling, Arthur felt a wave of shame wash over him. He had faced enemy fire, led men through treacherous terrain, made decisions that meant the difference between life and death. Yet here he was, cowering in his own home, defeated by a group of teenagers whose parents were probably in diapers when he was earning his medals. The next morning brought little respite. Arthur awoke to find his fears confirmed. His once pristine white fence was now a canvas of vulgar graffiti, the words too crude to even contemplate. But it was the note he found taped to his front door that truly chilled him to the bone. "Leave now, old man," it read in jagged, angry letters, "or things will get worse." For a long moment, Arthur stood on his porch, the note crumpled in his fist, surveying the damage to his property. The neighbor across the street, a young mother pushing a stroller, quickened her pace as she passed, averting her eyes from the scene. Arthur felt a stab of betrayal. Was there no one in this town willing to stand up for what was right? With a heavy heart, Arthur made the decision to return to the police station. Surely now, with tangible evidence of the escalating situation, they would have to take him seriously. He spent the morning documenting the damage, taking shaky photographs with an old Polaroid camera that had been Margaret's pride and joy. The walk to the station seemed longer this time, each step a battle against the arthritis in his knees and the weight of his despair. As he pushed open the heavy glass door, Arthur steeled himself, determined to make the officers understand the gravity of his situation. Officer Mitchell was once again at the front desk, his youthful face a stark contrast to the weariness Arthur felt in his bones. As Arthur approached, he saw a flicker of recognition in the young officer's eyes, quickly replaced by a look of barely concealed annoyance. "Mr. Graham," Mitchell said, his tone clipped, "what can we do for you today?" Arthur took a deep breath, willing his voice to remain steady. "Officer, I'm here to report a series of escalating incidents at my home. Vandalism, harassment, threats. I have photographic evidence this time." He spread the Polaroids on the desk, each image a testament to the ordeal he had been enduring. Mitchell glanced at them, his expression unreadable. "Look," the officer began, his voice tinged with impatience. "I understand you're upset, but this looks like typical teenage pranks to me. Eggs, graffiti. It's annoying, sure, but hardly a police matter." Arthur felt his temper flare, a spark of his old fire igniting in his chest. "Pranks," he repeated, his voice rising. "Officer, they're threatening me. They've vandalized my property repeatedly. I don't feel safe in my own home. Isn't it your job to protect citizens like me?" Mitchell's eyes narrowed, a hint of condescension creeping into his tone. "Mr. Graham, With all due respect, we have limited resources. We can't go chasing after every kid with a spray can. Have you tried talking to their parents?" The dismissal in Mitchell's voice was like a physical blow. Arthur found himself gripping the edge of the desk, knuckles white with the effort of maintaining his composure. "Their parents?" he echoed, disbelief coloring his words. "Officer, I don't even know who these kids are. They come in the night, they hide in the shadows. They're cowards, but they're dangerous cowards. Can't you see that?" From across the room, Officer Davis chimed in, his voice laden with mock sympathy. "Sounds like someone's having trouble adjusting to the modern world. Maybe it's time to consider a retirement communities, eh? Somewhere with security guards to keep those scary teenagers at bay." The laughter that followed was like a knife twisting in Arthur's gut. He looked from Mitchell to Davis, searching for any sign of understanding, of basic human empathy. But all he saw were two young men, barely more than boys themselves, drunk on the power of their badges and blind to the suffering of those they had sworn to protect. "I served this country," Arthur said quietly, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt. "I put my life on the line so that people like you could sleep safely in your beds at night. And this is how you repay that sacrifice, by mocking an old man who's asking for help." The silence that followed was deafening. Mitchell had the grace to look somewhat abashed, but Davis merely rolled his eyes, clearly unmoved by Arthur's words. "Look, Mr. Graham," Mitchell finally said, his tone softening slightly. "I understand you're frustrated, but there's really not much we can do without catching these kids in the act. Why don't you try setting up a security camera? That way, if something does happen, you'll have concrete evidence we can act on." Arthur stared at the young officer, a mixture of disbelief and resignation washing over him. A security camera. As if he, living on a fixed income, could afford such a luxury. As if the mere presence of a camera would deter those who had already shown such blatant disregard for law and decency. "Is that all?" Arthur asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mitchell nodded, already turning his attention back to the paperwork on his desk. "That's all we can do for now, Mr. Graham. If you manage to identify any of the individuals involved, or if you capture any criminal acts on camera, please don't hesitate to come back." Arthur gathered his photographs, each image a reminder of his helplessness in the face of bureaucratic indifference. As he turned to leave, he caught sight of his reflection in the glass door, an old man, stooped and gray, a far cry from the proud soldier he had once been. The walk home was a blur, Arthur's mind reeling from the encounter at the police station. The sun was setting as he approached his house, casting long shadows across the graffiti-covered fence. In the fading light, the crude messages seemed to leer at him, a stark reminder of his vulnerability. As Arthur fumbled with his keys, a sudden movement in his peripheral vision made him freeze. There, at the edge of his property, stood a group of teenagers, their faces partially obscured by hoodies. They made no move towards him, but their very presence was a threat, a silent promise that his ordeal was far from over. With shaking hands, Arthur let himself into his house, slamming the door behind him and engaging every lock. He leaned against the door, his heart pounding in his chest, listening intently for any sound of approach. But there was only silence, broken occasionally by distant laughter that seemed to mock his fear. In that moment, surrounded by the mementos of a life lived with courage and honor, Arthur Graham felt truly alone. The system he had once believed in, had fought to protect, had failed him utterly. As he sank into his armchair, his gaze fell on the old wooden box containing his medals. They gleamed in the dim light, a reminder of a time when bravery and sacrifice meant something. Arthur closed his eyes, fighting back tears of frustration and despair. He was a stranger in his own home, a relic in a world that had moved on without him. But as the night deepened around him, a spark of determination flickered to life in his weary heart. He had faced worse odds before, had stared death in the face, and emerged victorious. This battle might be different, fought not with guns and grenades, but with perseverance and dignity, but it was a battle nonetheless. And Arthur Graham had never been one to surrender without a fight. As he drifted into an uneasy sleep, Arthur's mind was already working, formulating plans and strategies. He might be old, he might be alone, but he was far from defeated. The war hero within him was awakening, ready to face this new challenge with all the courage and resourcefulness he could muster. Little did Arthur know that the coming days would test his resolve in ways he could never have imagined, bringing both unexpected allies and unforeseen consequences that would shake the very foundations of Millbrook's complacent existence. The Millbrook police station buzzed with its usual morning activity, the clatter of keyboards, the hum of conversation, and the ever-present aroma of stale coffee. Officer Jennifer Jennings, a seasoned veteran with 15 years on the force, sat at her desk, methodically working her way through a stack of reports. Her sharp eyes scanned each document, years of experience allowing her to quickly separate the urgent from the routine. As she reached for the next file, a name caught her attention: Arthur Graham. Something about it tugged at her memory, a half-forgotten story from years ago. Frowning, Jennings set aside the report and turned to her computer, fingers flying over the keyboard as she began to dig deeper. Across the room, Officers Mitchell and Davis were engaged in their usual morning banter, rehashing the previous night's baseball game with animated gestures. Their laughter carried across the bullpen, drawing a few good-natured eye rolls from their colleagues. "Hey, Mitchell," Davis called out, a smirk playing on his lips. "Did you hear about that old guy who came in yesterday? The one ranting about teenagers vandalizing his yard?" Mitchell groaned, shaking his head. "Don't remind me. Thought he'd never leave. Some people just can't handle getting old, you know." Their laughter was cut short by the sharp voice of Officer Jennings. "Mitchell, Davis, my office. Now." The two younger officers exchanged puzzled glances before making their way to Jennings' small, cluttered office. As they entered, they found her standing behind her desk, her expression unreadable. "Close the door," she instructed, her tone leaving no room for argument. Once they were seated, Jennings fixed them with a steely gaze. "I want you to tell me everything about your interactions with Arthur Graham. And I mean everything." Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It's like we said in the report, ma'am. Just an old guy complaining about some kids messing around in his yard. Nothing serious." Jennings' eyes narrowed. "Nothing serious? Is that why you thought it was appropriate to mock him and dismiss his concerns without even filing a proper report?" The color drained from Mitchell's face as he realized the gravity of the situation. Davis, sensing the shift in atmosphere, attempted to backpedal. "We didn't mean any disrespect, Officer Jennings. It's just, we get calls like this all the time. Kids being kids, you know?" "Kids being kids," Jennings repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "Tell me, officers, did either of you bother to run a background check on Mr. Graham? Did you take even a moment to consider who he might be beyond just some old guy?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Jennings sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose in frustration. "Let me educate you then. Arthur Graham is not just some senile old man looking for attention. He's a decorated war hero, a recipient of the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart." She turned her computer monitor towards them, revealing a newspaper clipping from decades ago. The headline read, "Local Hero Receives Highest Honor," accompanied by a photo of a young, proud Arthur Graham in full military dress. "In 1968, Jennings continued, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and anger, "Lieutenant Arthur Graham led a daring rescue mission deep behind enemy lines. He saved the lives of over a dozen men, carrying the last soldier out on his back despite being severely wounded himself." Mitchell and Davis sat in stunned silence, the enormity of their mistake beginning to sink in. "But that's not all," Jennings pressed on, her words cutting through their shock. "After returning home, Mr. Graham continued to serve his community. He volunteered at the VA hospital, mentored troubled youth, and was a pillar of this town for decades, and you two dismissed him like he was nothing more than a nuisance." The shame on the young officers' faces was palpable. Mitchell opened his mouth to speak, but Jennings held up a hand, silencing him. "I'm not interested in your excuses," she said firmly. What I want to know is how we're going to make this right. Because let me tell you, gentlemen, if word gets out about how the Millbrook Police Department treated a war hero, we'll be lucky if all we face is public outrage. Davis, his usual bravado completely deflated, spoke up hesitantly. What can we do, Officer Jennings? Jennings leaned back in her chair, fixing them both with a hard stare. First, you're going to write up a full, detailed report of every interaction you've had with Mr. Graham, every word, every dismissive gesture. I want it all documented. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Then, we're going to launch a full investigation into these vandalism claims. I want patrols increased in Mr. Graham's neighborhood, and I want you two to personally apologize to him for your unprofessional behavior. Mitchell nodded, his face a mask of contrition. Yes, ma'am. We'll make this right. I promise. You're damn right you will, Jennings replied, her tone softening slightly. Look, I understand that not every call we get is a matter of life and death, but our job is to serve and protect all members of this community, regardless of their age or the perceived severity of their complaints. Mr. Graham deserved better from us. As the two chastened officers left her office, Jennings turned back to her computer, staring at the image of the young Arthur Graham. His eyes, even in the grainy newspaper photo, seemed to bore into her, a reminder of the sacrifices made by those who came before. With a determined set to her jaw, Jennings grabbed her jacket and car keys. It was time to pay Mr. Graham a visit, to offer the apology and assistance he should have received from the start. As she drove through the quiet streets of Millbrook, Jennings couldn't help but reflect on how easily a person's history could be forgotten, how quickly society could discard those it once hailed as heroes. The modest house at the end of Maple Street came into view, its faded paint and overgrown lawn a stark contrast to the well-manicured properties surrounding it. As Jennings pulled up to the curb, she noticed the graffiti marring the fence, the scattered debris on the lawn that spoke of repeated vandalism. Taking a deep breath, she approached the front door, her knock echoing in the quiet of the afternoon. For a long moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, the door creaked open, revealing the weathered face of Arthur Graham. "Mr. Graham?" Jennings began, her voice filled with genuine respect. "My name is Officer Jennifer Jennings. I'm here to apologize on behalf of the Millbrook Police Department, and to assure you that we're taking your situation very seriously." Arthur's eyes, clouded with suspicion and hurt, searched her face for any sign of deception. Finding none, he stepped back, wordlessly inviting her inside. As Jennings crossed the threshold, she knew that this visit was more than just a professional obligation. It was a chance to right a wrong, to honor a man who had given so much for his country and community, and perhaps, in the process, to remind the town of Millbrook of the values it had seemingly forgotten. Little did she know that this simple act of acknowledgement would set in motion a chain of events that would not only change Arthur's life, but shake the very foundations of Millbrook's complacent existence. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Arthur Graham's front yard as Officer Jennifer Jennings stepped out of her patrol car. The quiet of the neighborhood was oppressive, broken only by the distant laughter of children playing several streets over. As she made her way up the cracked sidewalk, Jennings couldn't help but notice the signs of neglect and vandalism that marred the once proud home. Graffiti sprawled across the fence in garish colors, crude messages that made Jennings' jaw clench in anger. Eggshells and remnants of shattered bottles littered the overgrown lawn. It was a stark testament to the ordeal Arthur had been enduring, and a damning indictment of the community's indifference. Jennings took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. She had rehearsed her words a dozen times on the drive over, but now, faced with the reality of Arthur's situation, they seemed woefully inadequate. Her knock on the weathered door echoed in the quiet afternoon. For a long moment, there was no response, and Jennings found herself wondering if Arthur was even home. Then, slowly, she heard the shuffle of feet and the click of multiple locks being disengaged. The door creaked open, revealing Arthur Graham. The man who stood before Jennings was a far cry from the proud soldier in the old newspaper clipping. His shoulders were stooped, his face lined with weariness and suspicion. But his eyes, when they met Jennings, still held a glimmer of the strength and dignity that had once defined him. "Mr. Graham," Jennings began, her voice filled with genuine respect. "I'm Officer Jennifer Jennings from the Millbrook Police Department. I've come to speak with you about your recent visits to the station and the issues you've been facing." Arthur's expression remained guarded, but after a moment's hesitation, he stepped back, wordlessly inviting her inside. The interior of the house was dim, the heavy curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. As Jennings' eyes adjusted to the gloom, she took in the modest furnishings, the walls lined with faded photographs and mementos of a life richly lived. "Please, have a seat," Arthur said, his voice rough with disuse. He gestured to an old armchair, its fabric worn but clean. Jennings sat, watching as Arthur lowered himself into the chair opposite her with a barely suppressed wince. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and lingering hurt. "Mr. Graham," Jennings finally said, leaning forward slightly. "I want to start by offering you my sincere apologies for the way you were treated at the station. It was unprofessional, disrespectful, and completely unacceptable." Arthur's eyebrows rose slightly, surprise flickering across his features. "I appreciate that, Officer Jennings. But if you don't mind my asking, what brought about this sudden change of heart?" Jennings took a deep breath. "To be frank, Mr. Graham, I came across your file this morning. I know who you are, what you've done for this country and this community." She watched as a complex mix of emotions played across Arthur's face: pride, pain, and a deep, abiding weariness. "Who I was," Arthur corrected gently. "That man, he feels like a stranger to me now." Jennings leaned forward, her voice soft but intense. "No, Mr. Graham, who you are, your service, your sacrifices, they didn't end when you took off the uniform. You've continued to serve this community in countless ways over the years. And we failed you." Arthur's eyes glistened with unshed tears, his hands trembling slightly as he clasped them in his lap. "I never wanted special treatment, Officer Jennings. I just wanted to be heard, to be taken seriously." "And you deserved that, at the very least," Jennings agreed. "Which is why I'm here now. I want you to know that we're taking your complaints very seriously. We're increasing patrols in your neighborhood, and I personally will be overseeing the investigation into the vandalism and harassment you've experienced." For the first time since she'd arrived, Jennings saw a flicker of hope in Arthur's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a weary skepticism. "That's all well and good, officer," he said. "But what about the next time? The next old-timer who comes in with a complaint that seems trivial? Will they be dismissed too, until someone happens to look up their war record?" The question hung in the air between them, a challenge and a plea rolled into one. Jennings felt the weight of it, understanding that her answer would define not just this moment, but the very nature of her duty as an officer. "You're right," she admitted after a long moment. "This isn't just about you, Mr. Graham. It's about every member of this community who deserves to be heard and protected. I can't change what happened, but I can promise you this: your experience will be a catalyst for change in our department." As she spoke, Jennings' gaze was drawn to a wooden box sitting on a side table. Its lid was slightly ajar, revealing a glint of metal within. With a start, she realized she was looking at Arthur's military medals. "May I?" she asked, gesturing towards the box. Arthur nodded, a mix of pride and sorrow in his eyes as Jennings carefully opened the lid. The medals lay nestled in velvet, each one a testament to courage, sacrifice, and duty. As she lifted the bronze star, its weight seemed to carry the gravity of all Arthur had endured, both in war and in the years since. "You know," Jennings said softly, "my grandfather served in the same war. He didn't talk about it much, but I remember the look in his eyes when he did. The same look I see in yours now." She gently replaced the medal, turning back to Arthur with newfound determination. "Mr. Graham, I can't undo the disrespect you faced, but I swear to you, We will make this right, not just for you, but for every citizen of Millbrook who deserves our protection and respect." As she spoke, Jennings noticed a subtle change in Arthur's demeanor. His shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly, and a spark of his old fire seemed to reignite in his eyes. "I appreciate that, Officer Jennings," he said, his voice stronger than before. "But I hope you understand, I can't just sit back and wait for the police to solve all my problems. I may be old, but I'm not helpless." Jennings nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I wouldn't expect anything less from a man with your history, Mr. Graham. In fact, I was hoping we might be able to work together on this. Your insight, your experience, they could be invaluable in addressing not just your situation, but the larger issues facing our community." For the first time since her arrival, a genuine smile crossed Arthur's face. It was a transformation, erasing years from his countenance and offering a glimpse of the man he had once been, the leader, the protector, the hero. "Well, Officer Jennings," he said, a hint of his old strength in his voice, "I think that's an offer I'd be foolish to refuse." As they continued to talk, the afternoon light slowly fading outside, Jennings felt a sense of hope growing within her. She had come here expecting to offer an apology and a promise of action. Instead, she found herself on the cusp of something much larger, a partnership that had the potential to not just solve Arthur's problems, but to heal the rifts in their community. As she finally rose to leave, Jennings turned back to Arthur, who now stood straighter, a new purpose evident in his bearing. "Mr. Graham," she said, "I think this is the beginning of something important, not just for you or for the police department, but for all of Millbrook." Arthur nodded, a determined glint in his eye. "I think you might be right, Officer Jennings, and I, for one, am ready for the challenge." As Jennings walked back to her patrol car, she couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement mixed with trepidation. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be resistance, both from within the department and from the community at large. But as she glanced back at Arthur's house, seeing him standing tall in the doorway, she knew that together they had the potential to make a real difference. The sun had nearly set as Jennings drove away, casting long shadows across Maple Street. But for the first time in a long while, those shadows seemed less threatening, less ominous. Instead, they were a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope and change were possible, if only one had the courage to stand up and fight for what was right. The Millbrook police station buzzed with an unusual energy the following morning. Word of Officer Jennings' discovery about Arthur Graham had spread quickly, and there was a palpable sense of shame and determination in the air. Chief Roberts had called an all-hands meeting, and as the officers filed into the briefing room, the usual chatter was notably absent. Chief Roberts, a stocky man with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, stood at the front of the room, his expression grave. As the last officer took their seat, he cleared his throat, silencing the few whispered conversations. "All right, listen up," he began, his voice carrying a weight that commanded attention. "We've got a situation here that needs addressing, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We screwed up, plain and simple." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, meeting each officer's eyes in turn. Arthur Graham, a decorated war hero and longtime resident of Millbrook, came to us for help. And what did we do? We dismissed him, mocked him, treated him like he was nothing more than a nuisance. The shame in the room was palpable. Officer Mitchell, who had been directly involved in dismissing Arthur's complaints, stared at the floor, unable to meet the chief's gaze. "This isn't just about Mr. Graham," the chief continued. "It's about every citizen who comes to us for help. It's about the oath we took to serve and protect. Somewhere along the line, we forgot what that really means." He turned to the whiteboard behind him, uncapping a marker with a decisive click. "So, here's what we're going to do. First, we're launching a full investigation into the vandalism and harassment Mr. Graham has been experiencing. I want increased patrols in his neighborhood, and I want every incident documented thoroughly." As he spoke, the chief began writing on the board, outlining a plan of action. Second, we're going to review our procedures for handling complaints, especially those from elderly or vulnerable members of our community. This kind of dismissal cannot happen again. Officer Jennings, sitting near the front of the room, raised her hand. Chief, if I may, I've spoken with Mr. Graham, and he's willing to work with us. I think his insights could be valuable, not just in resolving his own situation, but in helping us better serve the community as a whole. The chief nodded, a spark of interest in his eyes. Good thinking, Jennings. Set up a meeting with Mr. Graham. I want to hear his ideas personally. As the meeting continued, the initial atmosphere of shame began to shift. There was still embarrassment, certainly, but it was being replaced by a sense of purpose, a determination to make things right. Officer Mitchell, who had been silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke up. Chief, I was one of the officers who dismissed Mr. Graham's complaints. I'd like to apologize to him personally, if that's all right. The chief's expression softened slightly. I think that's a good idea. Mitchell, take Davis with you. You both need to understand the impact of your actions. As the meeting drew to a close, the chief had one final message for his officers. What happened with Mr. Graham is a wake-up call. People, we've gotten complacent, forgotten what it really means to serve this community. But starting today, that changes. We're going to earn back the trust of every citizen in Millbrook, one day at a time. The officers filed out of the briefing room with a new sense of purpose. For some, like Mitchell and Davis, there was the weight of personal responsibility to bear. For others, like Jennings, there was a feeling of cautious optimism, a belief that real change was possible. As the day progressed, the station was a flurry of activity. Officers pored over reports, looking for any incidents that might be connected to the harassment Arthur had experienced. Patrols were reorganized, with a particular focus on Arthur's neighborhood. And in a quiet corner of the station, Officer Jennings began putting together a community outreach program, hoping to bridge the gap that had grown between the police and the citizens they served. Meanwhile, across town, Officers Mitchell and Davis stood on Arthur's front porch, both looking uncomfortable in their dress uniforms. Mitchell raised his hand to knock, then hesitated, turning to his partner. What if he doesn't want to see us? He asked, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. Davis shook his head. Wouldn't blame him if he didn't, but we've got to try, right? It's the least we can do. Taking a deep breath, Mitchell knocked on the door. For a long moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, the door opened, revealing Arthur Graham. The old soldier stood tall, his posture straight despite his age. His eyes, sharp and clear, took in the two officers on his porch, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. Mr. Graham, Mitchell began, his voice thick with emotion. We've come to apologize. Our behavior was inexcusable, and we understand if you can't forgive us. But we want you to know how deeply sorry we are for dismissing your concerns and treating you with such disrespect. Arthur regarded them silently for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to the officer's surprise, he stepped back, opening the door wider. Why don't you come in? He said, his voice gruff but not unkind. I think we have a lot to talk about. As Mitchell and Davis followed Arthur into his home, they couldn't help but feel a mix of shame and hope. They knew that one apology couldn't undo the hurt they had caused, but perhaps it could be the first step towards making things right. Inside, Arthur led them to the living room, gesturing for them to sit. The walls were lined with photos and mementos, each one telling a story of a life lived in service to others. Mitchell's eyes were drawn to a framed photograph of a much younger Arthur, standing proud in his military uniform. Mr. Graham, Davis began, his voice hesitant. We can't change how we treated you before, but we want you to know that things are changing at the station. Your situation has opened our eyes to how we've been failing the community. Arthur nodded slowly, his gaze moving between the two young officers. It's easy to apologize when you've been caught out, he said, his voice carrying a hint of steel. The real test is what you do next. How you change, not just for me, but for everyone in Millbrook who needs your help. Mitchell leaned forward, his eyes earnest. You're absolutely right, sir. And we're committed to making those changes. In fact, we were hoping you might be willing to help us. Arthur's eyebrows rose slightly. Help you? In what way? Your experience? Your perspective? Davis explained. It could be invaluable in helping us better serve the community, especially our elderly residents. We've taken your trust for granted, and we want to earn it back. For a long moment, Arthur was silent, his eyes distant as if looking into the past. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, tinged with a mixture of sadness and hope. You know, when I came home from the war, I made a promise to myself. I promised that I would continue to serve, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. For years, I thought I was living up to that promise. But lately, I felt powerless, forgotten. He looked at the two officers, his gaze sharp and clear. If you're serious about making changes, about really serving this community, then yes, I'll help you. But understand this, I won't pull any punches. If I see something wrong, I'll say so. And I expect you to listen. Mitchell and Davis exchanged a glance, then nodded in unison. That's exactly what we need, Mr. Graham, Mitchell said. Your honesty, your experience, it could make a real difference. As the conversation continued, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. The initial tension eased, replaced by a cautious but growing sense of mutual respect. Arthur shared stories from his time in the service and his years in Millbrook, each anecdote offering insights into the challenges faced by veterans and elderly residents. By the time Mitchell and Davis rose to leave, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across Arthur's front yard. But for the first time in a long while, those shadows seemed less ominous. As they stood on the porch, preparing to leave, Mitchell turned to Arthur one last time. Mr. Graham, he said, his voice filled with genuine respect. Thank you for giving us this chance. We won't let you down. Arthur nodded, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. See that you don't, young man. I may be old, but I've still got some fight left in me. As the officers drove away, Arthur stood on his porch, watching their patrol car disappear around the corner. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't just about his own situation anymore. It was about the potential for real change in Millbrook. The next few weeks saw a flurry of activity in the small town. True to their word, the police department launched a full investigation into the vandalism and harassment Arthur had experienced. Patrols in his neighborhood increased, and officers made a point of checking in on him regularly. But the changes didn't stop there. Chief Roberts, taking Arthur's insights to heart, implemented a new training program for all officers, focusing on community engagement and sensitivity towards elderly and vulnerable residents. Officer Jennings spearheaded a series of town hall meetings, creating a forum where citizens could voice their concerns directly to the police. The impact was gradual but undeniable. Slowly but surely, the tension that had been building in Millbrook began to ease. Citizens who had long felt ignored or dismissed found themselves being heard and taken seriously. Arthur, true to his word, didn't pull any punches. He attended every town hall meeting, his voice strong as he shared his experiences and offered suggestions for improvement. His presence served as a constant reminder of the values the town had nearly forgotten: service, respect, and community. One sunny afternoon, about a month after that first apology, Arthur sat on his front porch, enjoying a rare moment of peace. The sound of laughter drew his attention to the street, where a group of teenagers was walking by. For a moment, old fears surfaced. But then something unexpected happened. One of the teens, a lanky boy with a mop of unruly hair, broke away from the group and approached Arthur's fence. "Mr. Graham," he called out, his voice wavering slightly. We wanted to say we're sorry for everything." Arthur stood slowly, making his way down the porch steps. As he reached the fence, he saw genuine remorse in the boy's eyes. Behind him, the other teens shuffled awkwardly, unable to meet Arthur's gaze. "What's your name, son?" Arthur asked, his voice gentle. "Tommy, sir. Tommy Bradshaw." Arthur nodded, studying the boy's face. "Tommy, do you know why what you did was wrong?" The boy swallowed hard, then nodded. "Yes, sir. We didn't think about how it would affect you. We thought it was just a joke, but it wasn't funny at all. It was cruel." For a long moment, Arthur said nothing. Then, slowly, he extended his hand over the fence. "Thank you for your apology, Tommy. It takes courage to admit when you've done wrong." As Tommy shook his hand, relief washing over his face, Arthur continued. "Now, how about you and your friends come by tomorrow afternoon? I think my fence could use a fresh coat of paint, and I could use some strong young arms to help." The transformation in the teens was immediate. Shoulders straightened, eyes brightened with purpose. "Yes, sir," Tommy exclaimed. "We'll be here, I promise." As the group walked away, their excited chatter drifting back to him, Arthur couldn't help but smile. It wasn't just about painting a fence, it was about rebuilding connections, about teaching these young people the value of community and respect. Later that evening, as Arthur sat in his living room, his gaze fell on the old wooden box containing his medals. For the first time in years, he felt a surge of the old pride, the sense of purpose that had driven him throughout his life. He wasn't just a relic of the past, he realized. He still had a role to play, a way to serve his community. The next day, as he watched the teenagers diligently painting his fence, Arthur felt a renewed sense of hope. Officer Jennings stopped by to check in, and Arthur couldn't help but notice the way she smiled at the sight of the young people working alongside him. "Looks like you've got quite the crew here, Mr. Graham," she said, her eyes twinkling. Arthur nodded, a contented smile on his face. "Just doing my part, officer. We've all got a role to play in making this community better." As Jennings drove away, Arthur turned back to his young helpers. "All right, team," he called out, his voice strong and clear. "Let's see if we can finish this section before lunch. I've got some stories to tell you about what it means to be part of a community." The teens gathered around, paintbrushes in hand, eager to listen. And as Arthur began to speak, sharing tales of his military service and his years in Millbrook, he felt a warmth spreading through him. This, he realized, was what he had been missing. Not just being respected, but being able to pass on his experiences to help shape the next generation. The change in Millbrook didn't happen overnight. There were still challenges to face, still moments of tension and misunderstanding. But with each passing day, the town seemed to remember a little more of what it meant to be a true community. And at the heart of it all was Arthur Graham, no longer the forgotten veteran, but a living link between the past and the future. His story had become a catalyst for change, a reminder that every voice deserved to be heard, every member of the community valued. As the summer sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the freshly painted fence, Arthur looked out at the town he had called home for so many years. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly at peace. The battles he fought now were different from those of his youth, but no less important. And as he watched the next generation begin to understand the true meaning of service and community, Arthur knew that his legacy would live on long after he was gone. The Millbrook Police Department, once a source of frustration and disappointment, had become a partner in this transformation. Officer Jennings, Chief Roberts, and even young officers like Mitchell and Davis were working tirelessly to rebuild trust and strengthen community bonds. As night fell and the last of the teenagers headed home, promises to return soon echoing in the air, Arthur stood on his porch one last time. The street was quiet now, but it was a peaceful quiet, full of promise and possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. And Arthur Graham, veteran, citizen, and now mentor, would be ready to face them head-on. With a satisfied nod, he turned and went inside, leaving the porch light on, a beacon of welcome and a symbol of the change that had come to Millbrook. The war hero had found a new mission, and the town had rediscovered its heart. Together, they were writing a new chapter in the story of their community, one of respect, understanding, and unity. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and new beginnings as Millbrook prepared for a day unlike any other in its recent history. The town square, usually quiet on a Saturday morning, buzzed with activity. Volunteers scurried about, hanging banners, arranging chairs, and setting up a small stage in front of the old courthouse. At the center of it all stood Officer Jennifer Jennings, clipboard in hand, directing the preparations with a mix of excitement and nervous energy. Her eyes constantly scanned the growing crowd, searching for one particular face. "Everything all set, Jennings?" Chief Roberts asked, approaching with a steaming cup of coffee in each hand. He offered one to her, which she accepted gratefully. "Just about, Chief," she replied, taking a sip. "I just hope we've done enough. After everything Mr. Graham's been through, he deserves nothing but the best." The chief nodded, his usually stern face softening. "You've done good work here, Jennings, not just for Mr. Graham, but for the whole town." As they spoke, a ripple of excitement passed through the crowd. All eyes turned to the corner of Main Street, where a police cruiser had just pulled up. Officer Mitchell stepped out, moving around to open the passenger door with a flourish. Arthur Graham emerged slowly, his eyes wide with surprise as he took in the scene before him. He had been told there would be a small ceremony to acknowledge the changes in the community, but this was far beyond anything he had expected. The crowd parted as Arthur made his way towards the stage, leaning on his cane but walking with his head held high. As he passed, people reached out to shake his hand, pat him on the back, or simply nod in respect. The teenagers who had once tormented him now formed an impromptu honor guard, their faces solemn and proud. Mayor Thompson, a portly man with a booming voice, stepped up to the microphone as Arthur took his seat on the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "all we are gathered here today to honor a man who has served this country and this community with distinction for longer than many of us have been alive." As the mayor spoke, recounting Arthur's military service and his years of quiet contribution to Millbrook, Arthur felt a lump forming in his throat. He glanced out at the sea of faces before him, neighbors he had known for decades, young people he had only recently begun to mentor, and even a few faces he didn't recognize. All were watching him with a mixture of respect, admiration, and in some cases, a touch of shame for how long it had taken them to recognize the hero in their midst. Chief Roberts stepped up next, his voice carrying across the square as he detailed the changes that had been implemented in the police department. "Mr. Graham's experience opened our eyes to how far we had strayed from our core mission," he admitted. "But it also showed us the way back. Thanks to his guidance and the efforts of officers like Jennifer Jennings, we are once again a department that truly serves and protects all members of our community." One by one, speakers took the stage. Officer Mitchell, his voice thick with emotion, publicly apologized for his earlier behavior and thanked Arthur for the lessons in humility and service he had taught. Tommy Bradshaw, speaking on behalf of the teenagers, shared how their interactions with Arthur had changed their perspective on respect and community involvement. As the ceremony continued, Arthur found himself overwhelmed by the outpouring of support and gratitude. This was far more than just an apology or an acknowledgement of past wrongs. It was a community coming together, rediscovering its heart and soul. Finally, it was Arthur's turn to speak. As he made his way to the microphone, leaning heavily on his cane, a hush fell over the crowd. For a moment, he simply stood there, looking out at the faces of his neighbors, his community. "I never sought recognition for my service," he began, his voice wavering slightly before gaining strength. "When I came home from the war, all I wanted was to live in peace and to continue serving in whatever way I could. For many years, that's exactly what I did." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. But somewhere along the way, something changed, not just for me, but for all of us. We forgot what it meant to be a community. We stopped seeing each other, stopped listening. Arthur's voice grew stronger, filled with passion and conviction. "What happened to me was unfortunate, but it led to something beautiful. It reminded us all of the values we hold dear: respect, service, and the power of standing together. I see those values here today, in all of your faces. As he continued to speak, sharing his hopes for the future of Millbrook and challenging everyone present to continue the work they had begun, Arthur felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The bitterness and hurt of the past months faded, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose and belonging. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a small plaque that would be installed in front of the courthouse. It bore a simple inscription, "In honor of Arthur Graham and all those who serve their community with quiet dignity and unwavering courage." As the crowd began to disperse, many lingered to speak with Arthur personally. Children asked for stories of his time in the service, while their parents expressed their admiration and, in some cases, their apologies for not having stepped up sooner. Officer Jennings approached Arthur as the square slowly emptied, a warm smile on her face. "Well, Mr. Graham, what did you think?" Arthur chuckled, shaking his head in wonder. "It was overwhelming, to be honest, but in the best possible way. You've all done something remarkable here, Officer Jennings. Something that goes far beyond just me." Jennings nodded, her expression serious. "We couldn't have done it without you, Mr. Graham. Your strength, your forgiveness, it showed us all what true service looks like." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the square, Arthur found himself alone on the stage. He looked out at the town he had called home for so many years, seeing it with new eyes. The old building seemed to stand a little straighter, the streets a little cleaner. But more than that, there was a new energy in the air, a sense of purpose and community that had been missing for far too long. Arthur Graham, once forgotten and dismissed, had become a catalyst for change. His story had reminded Millbrook of its best self, of the values that had once defined it. And as he slowly made his way home, nodding to neighbors who called out greetings, Arthur knew that his work was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, of course. Change never comes easily, and old habits can be hard to break. But as he reached his front porch and turned to look back at the town, Arthur felt a sense of hope, stronger than any he had experienced since his days in uniform. Millbrook had rediscovered its heart, its sense of community and purpose. And Arthur Graham, the unassuming hero who had never sought the spotlight, found himself at the center of it all. Not as a relic of the past, but as a bridge to the future. A living reminder of the power of service, respect, and unwavering courage. As night fell and the stars began to twinkle overhead, Arthur Graham stood on his porch, looking out at the town he loved. The porch light cast a warm glow, a beacon of welcome in the darkness, and in that moment, surrounded by the quiet of the evening and the knowledge of the change he had helped bring about, Arthur felt truly at peace. The war hero had found a new mission. The forgotten veteran had become a cherished mentor, and Millbrook had taken the first steps on a journey of renewal and rediscovery. As Arthur finally turned to go inside, he couldn't help but smile. The future, once so bleak and uncertain, now shone with promise, and he, Arthur Graham, would be there to help guide the way, one day at a time.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.